Claudia Berger is our next esteemed speaker, and Claudia is a qualified social worker. She got her stripes from Stellenbosch University. I won't say how many years ago, but enough to come and stand here and speak with authority. She's also been intimately involved with many sort of trauma-based government programs, and specifically she spent 9 years on a program that worked with child and youth, but specifically for abused girls. So you spent 9 years on that program, yeah. And she spent the last 5 years researching trauma. And Claudia's going to share her knowledge and insight about trauma. And she's currently the director at ANEX, that's ANEX, correct? Which is an acronym for Activist Network Against the Exploitation of Children. So very hard work that she's doing, very sort of, I think, personally taxing work. But I read her bio, and I must just say, I wish I could actually, I'm going to try and do this, just to put a little bit of the speakers' bios on the holding slide, because it was oozing passion for what she's doing. So I'm very privileged and humbled to introduce Claudia Berger from ANEX. Thank you.
Good afternoon. So what inspired me to go and look at what do we need to do about trauma? Besides having my own childhood trauma and spent about 20 years in psychotherapy, that didn't really make any difference. And maybe there's some of you here that can agree with that. I was the director of a home for a child and youth care center for abused girls for 9 years. And, you know, these girls come in and they've been in foster placements, or no one wants them anymore, and they're between the ages of 13 to 18. And then we work out a plan for them, and a week or a month down their stay at the children's home, lo and behold, everything will be wrong, and windows will be broken, and staff will be sworn at and attacked, and off they are to psychiatrists to be diagnosed. And they come back and they will have been diagnosed with either borderline or early bipolar or depression or defiance disorder and given medication. And they wouldn't take the medication, and next week it's the same story. And I've realized that we are missing something. And so my own research on trauma has started. And I was blown away by what I found in the theory, which just made so much sense. And that is what I want to share with you today, because I am sure that at schools you deal a lot and battle with the trauma that leaders bring to your environment. So I want to start off by a few questions. Do educators and schools have an informed role to play in the lives of students struggling with unprocessed traumatic memories, other than providing cognitive learning experiences? Are there any alternative strategies than a generation ago? Because I know ultimately you guys are being forced also to look at your results at the end of the year. I mean, the organization that I run at the moment, besides the fact that we deal with child exploitation, we work on community projects in the Karoo, in a small place called Murraysburg. And that school 2 years ago had the lowest pass rate in matric. So I mean, they didn't even allow us to come close to the school to work on emotional intelligence or with the learners, because the poor principal was then new the next year, and he was forced to have a certain amount of learners in grade 12 to pass. And I want to ask you, what do you know about the brain, early childhood development, and trauma? Okay, so what's very interesting for me is that there's a lot of happening in the psychology and psychiatry realm at the moment in terms of what are we doing to ourselves and to our children. What are we doing in terms of technology and wanting all kinds of iPads and stuff in our schools, and at night sitting people in front of their televisions? Because human beings are at our core relational creatures. And if you don't take any message from me today, that is my message for you today. Because I'm also going to tell you that the brain develops through repetition and by relation from other people. It's not only a genetic organ. So we are designed to live, work, play, and work in groups. And this is a statement by Bruce Perry, who's one of the world-renowned child psychiatrists. Relationships are the absolute heart of humanity, and we are neurobiologically designed to be in relationships. In talks that he's given recently, he said that our biggest biological gift as human beings is to be in relationships. And one of the things that's so fascinating about human beings is that we invent stuff, but a lot of stuff that we invent currently is not good for the way that we are biologically made. And he speaks about, she spoke about the input that children get. And he speaks about the fact that when we lived earlier years, people lived in extended families all together. So a child used to have 4 adults that gave input into that child's life. I was thinking about the teacher that now says she works with 40 children. That is not good for the children's development, neither for your stress level. So currently a child gets a 24th of the input that children used to get in earlier age. So you learn language, social language, appropriate emotional regulation, and essentially everything that's important in life as a human being in context of relationships. And why am I saying that? So what you need to know about the human brain, and if you want to, I can send the slides to Samantha to send to all of you. The human brain is a pyramid, but that develops upside down. You might not be able to see the words there, but I'll explain it to you. The human brain develops from the most primitive parts upwards. That is why people can learn and study until they're 90 or 100, because your new cortex, as she explained, actually really start developing late, and it continued to develop. But not your bottom parts of your brain. And why is that important to know? Is that the part that's necessary for learning, which is the top part, your new cortex and your frontal cortex here, that develops in relation to how well the bottom part of your brain develop, which is the brain stem and the midbrain and then the limbic, where the emotions are seated. So the human brain has got 3 parts, basically. It's the new cortex, the midbrain, and then the reptilian brain, which is the bottom part of the brain, which is basically the brain stem, which is where your neck and your brain sort of meet. So the bottom part of the brain, which is the reptilian brain, is where your survival brain is, and that's basically the part that's basically formed when you're born. So it's like, I need to breathe, I need to eat, I need to, as Bruce Perry would say, the only thing that babies do is they eat, they pee, and they poo. So that is basically the part of your brain that's developed when you're born. The rest of your brain then develop in your relationship with your primary caregiver. So that just gives you an idea of the human brain. At the bottom, here on the right, is your brain stem. 2 is your limbic system, that's responsible for feeling, which is in the midbrain. And then at the top there is your cortex, which is responsible for thinking and higher functioning. So it's basically only the brain stem that's formed when you're born. Now your limbic system, which is part of the higher functioning part of the brain, but it's just under the new cortex. That's the emotional center of the brain. And she spoke about the amygdala, which is the part of your brain, which is like the alarm system of your brain. And then there's the top part of your brain, which is the new cortex. It's the most evolutionary advanced part of your brain. It governs your ability to speak, think, and solve problems. And it affects your creativity and your ability to learn. Okay, so I'm telling you that the brain is an upside-down pyramid. The bottom part developed first. Now, the largest and part of the brain last to develop is the cortex, which include our frontal lobes and the parts of the brain that control executive functions. Also, your language and abstract and concrete thoughts are there. And normally your brain is in proportion 2 to 1. So your top part of your brain should be a bit heavier or more developed. This proportion of the brain allows the limbic and the cortical functions, in other words, your higher reasoning skills, to modulate, control, and balance the brainstem and midbrain functions. And when I'm going to speak about trauma, you'll understand why I'm sharing this with you. So when we ask children, think before you act, we are asking them to use the higher part, the top part of the brain, to help them access and control what another part of the brain wants to do out of instinct, because your bottom part of the brain works on instinct. So what is trauma, and how does that relate to the brain? Is trauma an event or happening? Is it an individual's response to an event? Or is it the diagnostic criteria? Because you often hear people say, something very traumatic happened to me. So is it an event? One word that best captures the experience of trauma is terror. And one defines the experience of terror as feeling totally unsafe and powerless to do anything about one's situation. So it's not in the event, because what I might experience as trauma, you might not experience as trauma. So trauma is how your body experiences the event. Your body might experience it as terror and feel powerless and helpless. It's an exceptional experience in which the powerful and dangerous event overwhelm a person's capacity to cope. And what's very different from years ago now in the language that they use is trauma is a wound that needs to heal. So you change the way that you speak to people, and it's about not what's wrong with you, but what has happened to you. Now we get to the nitty-gritty of trauma. So when in normal brain development, the brain is on the left side. But when trauma happens, the brain is on the right side. Can you see the difference? And why children can't learn when they experience trauma, and I'll go more into that. When children experience trauma, the brainstem, which is the bottom part of the brain, which is responsible for survival, seems overdeveloped. Because trauma is about keeping safe and survival. So children will have overdeveloped safety and stress response and act more impulsively, even though the thinking, feeling part of the brain may be normally sized. When children experience neglect, they often did not develop the thinking, feeling parts of the brain, resulting in underdevelopment of higher reasoning parts of the brain. So when children experience neglect and trauma, there's an overdevelopment of the bottom part of the brain, which reacts on instinct and getting out of fear, and an underdevelopment of the limbic or the cortical part of the brain. And in actual fact, what happens is that your top part of the brain, which is your executive part of your brain, they call it, it goes offline. So what they do there's a child psychiatrist, he's actually a psychiatrist that practices mindfulness, and he uses a hand model of the brain. So if this is your brain, and at the bottom there's the brain stem, and here's your midbrain, here's the limbic system, and here's the cortex. So the top part here is your new cortex. So what happens when you experience trauma, they call it you flip your lid. So your new cortex here, which is your reasoning part of your brain, goes offline. And it leaves these parts of the brain, which is responsible for instinctive behavior, and your reflexes immediately. Now, also bearing in mind that in the top part of your brain, your executive part of your brain, is also your speech center, and where language is formed. So when they talk about, I experience speechless terror, that's exactly what you have. Because your speech center is also situated in the executive part of your brain. That's why when people or children have experienced trauma, they cannot remember, they can't tell you what's happened, and there's no storyline to it. So children are being wired, or people are being wired for survival. So that's why being impulsive, anxious, acting from instinct instead of reason, and not able to identify or understand feelings. So when the brain is in a survival mode, there it says the prefrontal cortex goes offline. And the limbic system, which is the middle part of the brain, and the lower parts take over. So it doesn't help that you say to a child, get over it, or it's all in your mind. Because trauma is stored in the part of your brain that's got nothing to do with the rational thinking. It's stored in the part of the brain that's linked to your body, your senses. Because if I ask you, when you had experienced trauma or had an incident or a family member loss or hijacked, what was your experiences? It was all of a bodily nature, all of a somatic nature. And that is where the trauma is stored. Bessel van der Kolk is one of the world-renowned psychiatrists on trauma, and his latest book is called The Body Remembers. The body keeps the score. So it tells you that the trauma is in the body. She spoke a little bit about the amygdala. It's in the part of the brain where the emotions is registered. Now this part of the brain helps manage fear and panic. And it's almost like a little alarm system of the brain that detects, is there danger or not? So when the amygdala is overstimulated, anxiety, hyperarousal, and hypervigilance occur. Children have meltdowns, a hard time calming down, and might overreact. Overexposure to stress reduces the ability of the amygdala to function correctly. So the amygdala is the part in your brain, if you come into a situation, it gets a sensor from the outside. And it must now determine, is it danger or not? But when you get exposed to stress, and if you think about children in your school who gets traumatized and who suffers from chronic trauma, maybe they live in a house where there's domestic abuse. So that amygdala works overtime to the point where it actually can't register anymore, is this now trauma or not? Everything is seen as trauma. So that alarm bell then, it works constantly. That's a little bit of info about it. It's an organ in the limbic system. It explores all information coming in by the senses to detect attractiveness or threat. It secures the survival of the individual and the species. In presence of danger, the higher thinking is short-circuited and hormones are produced in the hypothalamus. So what it says is, when there's too much danger, normally what happens is you're in a situation and you stand there and the amygdala takes the information to the higher parts of the brain to decide what must happen. But when you're in so much danger, like the children in your schools that's been traumatized, that doesn't happen. So just to show you, this is a diagram of normally how we operate when we get information. So on the left there's an emotional stimulus that comes in. Normally it goes first to the cortex. So say there is, I sense some smoke, and my higher part of the brain says, okay, let me first go and find out, is this serious or not, to determine how I should react. But when you're in trauma, and you're in a house, for instance, where your parents fight all the time, father is maybe an alcoholic, hits the mum, then you take the low road. You don't still think, because the cortex is also offline. So they react immediately. And it gets to a point where even in school, they're going to react on triggers because they can't discern anymore whether there's danger or not. So this is just to show you that the cortex go offline. So when there's a low emotion and there's no trauma, and when there's a high level of emotion and the cortex is disabled. I just want to say to you that creates quite a big problem in terms of the work that we do for when there's cases and people needs to be prosecuted for rape, or like the trafficking survivors that we work with. Because there's a timeline that the police have got to get evidence and statements and medical examinations. And because of this information that I now know, I understand why victims can't talk. I also understand the whole issue around safety. And it's not something that you can rectify in having a conversation, because that part of the brain first needs to be brought online. And the police will tell you, we've got 72 hours to get DNA or evidence. You're not going to get a person in 72 hours to get the higher part of the brain come online and let them feel safe. So she spoke about the importance of emotional intelligence, and she spoke about the fact that your higher part of your brain can develop until you die. But that's not the case for the part of your brain that's responsible for your emotional development, which needs to be stable for your top part of the brain to function properly. And that influences the learning of your learners at school. So just to show you how a baby's brain develops in the first 2 years, the size difference. And that's due to influence of relationships and caregivers. And why it is so important that we develop those things and attachment, good attachment in children. Okay, I just want you to have a look here at what Bruce Perry is saying about what are the 6 core strengths that every human being needs, and how it's a sequential development. That there's a sequence of development that happens in the brain, and it's got to do with our human nature. And the two is intrinsically linked to each other, in the sense of that attachment is one of your, if not the first human need that we all have to belong and to feel significant. And the importance of that is that if there's trauma that happens in the attachment relationship, or in your relationship with your caregiver, or there's no attachment, your ability to self-regulate and to manage emotions and to develop empathy, which is all characteristics that you need in terms of also to develop your learning ability, doesn't develop properly. And that all of us develop an internal working model from your primary caregiver in attachment. So when there's no attachment, your internal working model will be one of survival, and the world is a scary place because there's no one there to care for me. What he also says is that, we all probably in this room grew up in an era of let the baby cry until the baby fall asleep, maybe put the child in detention, or I know that there's still children's homes that got an isolation room. That's the worst thing that you can do to a child. And that Bruce Perry actually firmly believes that there isn't such a thing that you can actually spoil a child with too much attention. Because it's in that relationship with the caregiver that the child then learns how to regulate themselves, which is one of the most important things specifically for you guys working in the education system in terms of how that child is going to learn to manage their emotions. And he talks about a reward system. So in your relationship with your caregiver, you learn that if I'm hungry, I get fed. But if you don't get that reward system, that's when children often go to drugs and sex and stuff that's not good for them. So the last part of my presentation was about, so how does that reflect to the trauma in schools? Well, most children that experience trauma from home, and trauma that they've not had good, secure attachments. So they either have avoidant attachment or the attachment was not present at all. So, and I know this poses a question to educators, how am I supposed to do this? But I want to agree with Natasha that if we are not going to look at a different eye and a different perspective, and to the one teacher that spoke there, to education, we are not going to have success, and we're going to have more trauma and more riots and more children that's out of that perceived to be challenged. But in actual fact, what they're telling you is that they're craving for your attention because they don't get it at home. And unless we're going to have, they've developed overseas what they call, and you can go and Google it, it's called trauma-informed schools. And the bottom line is basically that I look at all the children that's in the school, that everyone experienced trauma. So does the teachers and the principal and the school governing body, because all of us do. And how do I approach you from the perspective that you actually come to me with behavior of which the root cause is trauma, not because you want to be defiant? Because trauma puts the brain in a fear-driven state. Because all that they do is they see every trigger outside as trauma. So this teacher today, and remember that trauma is, as I said, situated in the part of the brain that links to your senses. So it's sensory stuff. So I see a green or a red shirt today, and that reminds me immediately, it triggers my senses of something or what someone wore in trauma. The teacher comes and he speaks the same way as what my father speaks at home, who bullies me or abuses me. And I then react instinctively because the top part of my brain cannot tell me, but this is now not the instant that's happened. So part of what teachers need to do is what they call dual awareness. Is that you need to sit the child down, obviously when there's first a trusting relationship. Because children react, or people that experience trauma react on what they call your inner sense, in other words, what you feel the anxiety on the inside, and your outer sense. So I might walk in the street and I am very anxious because I was in a hijack, but it's gone. So my inner sense is still anxious, But I now need to scan my outer sense to see, am I still in the car? Am I going to be hijacked now? Is it the same situation? So you need to bring children to the present and to make them aware of what they call dual awareness. So if the child first must develop a trusting relationship with you, and that is not going to happen by asking the child, why didn't you do your homework? Or why don't you listen in class today? It's about setting an atmosphere in the class where maybe if you spend 5 minutes in the day, you might say to me, I'm crazy, but that's literally what it's going to take. Of setting the scene of, let's check in with each other, how are you doing? Because that sets the scene, and as she says, this is something that's going to take time. But I am trying to get a video from a guy that's ran a school overseas where they actually did a video over, I don't know if it's a year or months, of 6 learners that's been exposed to trauma-informed care in a school that's been known to have the worst of the worst children, and the effect that it's had on the learners. And the movie is called Paper Tigers, but I haven't been able to get it yet. And that school principal's name is Jim Spoorleder. And there's actually, if you go on YouTube, he talks there about how he's taken his school through this process. Spoorleder, Jim Spoorleder. I've actually connected with him on Facebook, and he's going to try and see if he can get the DVD for me, Paper Tigers. Spoorleder, Spoorleder. Now, what's very interesting and why I started with all of you about relationships is that we as human beings are relational creatures. And the brain develops to its full potential through relations. Because it's only the basic part of the brain that's formed when you're born. So that in itself will tell you and emphasize the huge responsibility that not only you but all of us have in terms of the children in our lives. Because the easiest way is that when I get home tonight, and thankfully my daughters are 22 and 24, but it still doesn't make it easier, is to sit someone in front of the TV, or everyone sits with their iPads and phones and whatever. But she also mentioned something, and that they've proven that the parts of your brain, the neurons in your brain that's not wired and doesn't get input from the primary caregiver, actually dies off. They say neurons that fire together, wire together. So children that's neglected and traumatized and severely abused, that parts of their brain that needs the input from the primary caregiver, that doesn't get it in attachment, actually dies. And you can never retrieve it again. And that is parts that's so important and vitally important to develop for the cognitive part of the brain to work and function completely. And children that's in a fear-driven state, then you cannot access the prefrontal neocortex, which is vital for your learning at school. And also because trauma is stored in the part of the brain that deals with your central nervous system. So you can now think, if you've been in a situation where someone drove in the back of your car or breaks into your house at night, you feel the trauma in your body immediately, the sweat, the palpitations. So that's where the trauma is stored. I mean, there's a lot recently been done on what they call trauma release exercises, because it's actually something that got stuck in your central nervous system that needs to be released again. That's why animals never experience post-traumatic stress. Because if a buck has been chased by a lion, he gets up, he has this tremor, and then he moves on. We don't have that tremor because our brain overrides that. So it's actually stuff that's been stuck in your body. And that's why low-key movement with children is actually vital in your school. Whether it's a dance movement, there's a lot of research that's been done in the past few years about how well yoga works for people who's experienced trauma, because it's not cardiovascular, so your heart rate can't go even higher, but you get in touch with your body. Because children and people who've experienced trauma can only access control over how to regulate their emotions if they can feel that they're in control of their bodies again. Because think about it, when you experience trauma, people sometimes wet themselves, they feel completely powerless and helpless. And that you're not going to regain by letting the top part of the brain come online again. You're only going to regain that by feeling in control of your body, your heart rate, and self-regulate. So you need to think of how can you access those parts of your children's brains to make them feel safe, so that the part that's actually responsible and going to respond to the cognitive learning comes online. And that's not going to come online by telling the child you're going to sit detention, or you're going to do some uitskryfwerk, or you're being stupid. Because by saying to them you've been stupid, you're just doing exactly the same what they hear at home in any case. And then we wonder why they react the way that they do. And what I have found at the children's home is they are going to react to stuff that you don't see as a trigger. Because remember, when you're in a traumatic state, everything is a trigger. And trauma actually makes your mind stay stuck in the past. But they walk around and it's like, I show a video clip to social workers where they show the alarm bell, the amygdala in the brain, and it rings 24 hours a day. So that child walks around and sees and hears and smells stuff all day long that reminds them, and they still think that the trauma is happening all the time. Because there's another part in the midbrain called the hippocampus. And the hippocampus it stores memory, so that happened yesterday, this happens today, this happens 5 minutes ago. When you're traumatized, your brain doesn't tell the hippocampus that the event has stopped. So in traumatized people's brains, the event hasn't stopped. It's carried on. And can you imagine for a child that lives in a home where there's permanent domestic violence, there's rape going on for years, why it's so difficult for people to get over trauma, and why cognitive therapy is not going to help? Because now you go and you want that person to narratively tell a story which they can't access and which actually re-traumatize them, instead of focusing on how can I slowly get their body to just start moving again. And you might not be able to be the primary attached figure for that child, but by being the teacher that child starts to develop a relationship with, that child might be able to access the parts of the brain that needs to come online for that child to have good academic achievements. And it is possible. So that is what my presentation would have said to you. What we have found is that children get diagnosed with either ADHD or even sometimes borderline. And what you need to do is you need to go and look at the trauma history of the child. Not only about what's happened now, because normally it's events that started years ago.
I want to thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting, very enlightening. And I wonder if government officials is actually aware of this information. I think they need to be made aware. Because if they perhaps realize just how big the problem is that teachers are faced with in the classroom, they may not have an excuse to say that they do nothing. The current learner-teacher ratio, according to national DVE, is 38 to 1 learners in the primary school. 38 learners to 1 teacher. Now, many schools up their school fees, they have governing body teachers, and they reduce that ratio perhaps to 32 or 30 to 1. But then, of course, there are many other schools who can't afford to employ governing body educators. They are sitting with 40 to 1, 45 to 1. The principal is counted in that learner-teacher ratio. So the principal should be 100% in the class in order to maintain a 38 to 1 learner-teacher ratio. Now, the situation is grossly unfair across the country. But at least if we can say, government, you know what the effects of these situations are. It's social. Teachers are contending with this. And the discipline challenges are just growing within the schools. But, yeah, I mean, I see a light in terms of what we can convey to our teachers.
You see, before, I think all of us said, yeah, we think, but now we have got research that's proven that's the way the brain and the body is made. And I mean, Bruce Perry is one that says, in one of his DVDs, he says that it's more important for a child to develop, to build healthy relationships in pre-primary than to be able to read in first grade already. Because that will develop when the emotional and the social skills. And as I say, you are actually humanly made that way.
I actually need to background to that one. Thank you very much for a wow presentation. They normally say it's a graveyard session when you come on for the second part, but I can assure you it wasn't a graveyard session. Yes, if DVD knows about what you have presented to us today, then maybe they will also start thinking about the CAPS document and the overload of work that we have as teachers, as educators, because you are loaded in primary schools with facts where the children do 2 sets of exactly the same thing. You know, it's your fact for now, it's fact 5 and fact 6. And I'm thinking in terms of languages. So you're getting exactly the same thing. And if that child has done badly in that first fact, chances are that there's not going to be any improvement in the second one.
Absolutely.
So the teacher is bogged down with all that mountains and mountains of marks.
Absolutely.
And all of this with a trauma. You have in our areas, I come from a noble talk, in our areas, our children are so traumatized, same as in Melbourne and Heidelberg and Guantanamo, because they have, when we go home, we leave the areas, these children stay behind, and many times they have to fall on the ground in the evening when shooting starts. They have to lie down, they sleep on the floor, and that is the trauma. And they come back, and I always say to the teacher, in most cases, the teacher is the only stable
Absolutely.
person.
Only the attachment figure. Yeah.
Because that child, I had a parent this morning, she had 2 children. One is 8 months, one is a year. And I asked her, whose children are these? Because I know her children are these. She said to me, I'm fostering these children. I said, are they from the same mother? She said, yes. 8 months and 1 year. And I thought, wow. I said, what happened to the mother? The mother's on drugs. And I thought, wow. I'm thinking in terms of school, when these children start school. And that is what we have in our schools. And government or the TVT, they're not worried, because at the end of the year, they want your figures. They're not worried about anything else. They're not worried about the trauma of the children or the trauma of the teachers.
Well, we biologically we're making things a lot worse currently, and there's even more information. You can go and Google a guy called Daniel Siegel. He talks about the fact that your right brain is your emotional brain, and as a teacher or educator or parent or caregiver, if a child is in trauma, your right brain needs to connect with that child's right brain, because you need to connect in order to be able to make or to influence. So I can't, with my logical brain, go and connect with the child. I need to go and connect with their right brain. Anyone else?
What advice would you have for us as educators to help us help parents who are doing
You know, with your current situation, the best thing that you can do is just to connect with them and make them feel that that you connect with them daily. Initially, they might still walk away, they might still swear at you. In this presentation, it's about an hour that Jim Sporleder do on YouTube. He talks about how he would approach children daily, and they would swear at him and they would walk away, but how they would then change because you keep on. You need to show children that's experiencing trauma that you're not going to walk away and abandon them as everyone else have done. So it's literally about daily connecting on their emotional side. How are you doing? Is there anything I need to know? And just keep on doing that. With that small little thing, you will get a breakthrough eventually.
You know, one thrives with a little attention. Anything thrives, and it does positively affect you, even if you say a kind word to someone.
Because you might be the only one that makes that child feel that I've been seen. And that might shift.
And that's your growth.
Yeah.